Okay, I've cleared the board again, and now I want to talk about three special rules in chess: promotion, castling, and en passant. First, let's talk about promotion. When a pawn, now remember the white pawn started on this second row, and they move you always move your pawns towards your opponent. In this case, white is set up on the bottom of the board, black is set up on the top of the board or screen, and the pawns are moving in this direction. Okay, so more than likely this white pawn, it started on this square here, and it probably has marched like this. Maybe it moved 2, and then it moved 1, then it moved 1 again, moved 1. Now what happens when a pawn gets to the very last row? Well, it gets promoted. And when a pawn gets to this last square here, you can promote it into another piece. Now you can't promote it to a king, and you can't promote it to a pawn, because that isn't promotion. But it changes into a queen, rook, bishop, or knight. So you're allowed those 4 choices: queen, rook, bishop, or knight. Okay? So, and the favorite promotion is usually the queen, because it's the most powerful piece on the board. So always think of every pawn as a potential queen. Okay, so in this case, if it was white to move, we'd simply move down here, and my program asks me what piece, and I select the queen, and now it becomes a queen, and now I continue the game. Okay, that's promotion. Let's talk about castling. Okay, I've set up this position, or cleared the board and set up this position to talk about castling. Castling is a move that involves the king and the rook. So I'm just highlighting the white king and the white rooks just to talk about it in general. Now what happens in castling is that the king and rook sort of move together. Okay, what it does is it actually moves the king to the side, to one side of the board, and the rook comes to the other side. It's almost like they're switching positions, but they really don't switch positions. Okay, what happens is that the king only ever moves 2 squares, and then the rook comes to the other side of the king. So let's say that if the king were the castle to this side, to the right side, it would move 2. Okay, and then the rook would actually move over to this square, this white square. So they don't really switch places, but they sort of move around each other. And the reason for castling is that it really protects your king. It gets your king off to the side of the board where it's safer. Okay, so likewise, if you were white were the castle on this side, the king would only ever move 2, and then the rook would come around to the other side. So the rook in this case would actually move 3 squares over to this side. Okay, so what are the rules for castling? Well, there's a couple rules. One, you cannot have moved the king before, so you can't move your king and move it back. Likewise, you could not have moved your rook before. So basically, the pieces that are involved cannot have moved. 2, there must be clear space. The spaces between where the pieces are going to castle must be clear. That's sort of why I set it up. Notice the board, there's no pieces on the back row. So let's say if this knight here were actually here, you would not be allowed to move, or would not be allowed to castle. In 3, the king cannot be in check. Okay? So if your opponent comes and threatens to capture your king, you cannot castle. Okay, so let's say the white or the black queen decided to move here, giving check, threatening to capture the king. The king cannot castle. Okay? The last rule is you can't castle through check, meaning wherever the king, if the squares the king is moving through and the square lands on cannot be check. So I want to move my attention to the other side of the board. Now, the black king can also looks like it can castle. Okay. Now it actually cannot castle this side. Remember, the king would move 2 squares over to this square, and the rook would move 2 squares over to this square. Now it can't move. Now let's just say the pieces have not moved, and the space is clear between them. The king's not in check, but the queen actually controls, or can actually move to this square. So when the king castles, it sort of goes to this square and this square. The king cannot castle through check, because when it's sort of moving through this square, it can actually be captured by the queen. Okay? So in this example, if it was white's turn, it could actually castle to both sides. Okay? It could castle this side, or it could castle this side. And if it was black's turn, it cannot castle this side. Okay, it cannot come to this side and move to this square. But it could castle this side. So let's say it was black's turn and black decided to move like this. That's called castling. The king moved 2 and the rook came the other side. Now let's say it was white's turn and white wanted to castle. Well, the king can move like this and castle. The king moved 2, the rook came to the other side. Hopefully this helps you understand how to castle. Okay, now let's go over the rule of en passant. En passant is another pawn rule. Remember when I discussed moving the pawn, it's allowed to move 2 squares off its original starting position. In this case, we actually have 2 pawns on the original starting position, these 2. So effectively, en passant really only affects pawn movements when they're making their initial move. Now remember I said a pawn in its original position can move 1 or it can move 2. Okay? It can move any one of these squares. Likewise, a black pawn can move, if it was black's turn, can move in any one of these 2 squares. So en passant is basically a capture rule. And what it allows you is that normally if you were only allowed to move 1 square at a time, let's say it was white's turn, and white moved the pawn like this, black would be allowed to capture the pawn like this. Okay? But what happens when black moves 2? Well, you're saying, geez, black's saying I got ripped off. I wasn't able to capture, I wanted to really capture this pawn right here, but it moved. Well, this is where en passant comes in, is that you're allowed to capture this white pawn as it's sort of passing through. I think en passant actually means in passing. So you're allowed to capture this white pawn in the passing. But one of the rules of en passant is that black must make this move the very next move. So black can actually capture it as if this white pawn were actually only moved 1 square. Notice how it disappeared. So white moved 2, and now black has to say on the next move, saying, I want to capture it. If it waits for another move, it's not allowed to do it. Okay? You can make the choice to capture the pawn. So, but if white moved 2, and then black decided to make a move, well then, and then white moves again, you're not allowed to try to black's not allowed to try to capture this pawn en passant. You must do it the very next move. Okay? So likewise, if it was black's turn, and it is black's turn, let's say black decides to move this pawn too. Well, white actually has the option to capture en passant. Okay? But it has to do it right now on this move. If it waits a move, it can't use this rule. So en passant is sort of like a, you have to use it or lose it. You have to make the decision. Let's say black decided to capture en passant. It acts as if the black pawn is still there, it captures, and the black pawn disappears. Okay.